Picture yourself standing in the middle of an ancient Roman city. Beneath your feet runs a vast network of sewers. In the distance, enormous public bathhouses rise above the streets, while fresh water flows through the city in carefully engineered channels. It all looks astonishingly advanced. But here's the strange part. The Romans had no concept of washing their hands to kill germs. They could build sophisticated systems to carry waste away, yet they had no idea bacteria even existed. They bathed regularly, but washing their hands before eating or before touching a wound was rarely seen as something medically necessary. Clean cities, dirty hands. Hearing that, you might assume ancient people were simply filthy. But this is where the story gets interesting. They actually cared a great deal about cleanliness. Their definition of clean was just very different from ours. Ancient communities tried to keep foul-smelling waste away from living areas, developed rules around bathing and appearance, and used perfumes or scented substances to keep the body smelling pleasant. In other words, they weren't against hygiene. They simply didn't know what they were supposed to be protecting themselves from. Now go back to Rome. Massive aqueducts could carry fresh water from sources dozens of miles away and supply enormous urban populations. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering. But what happened after someone used the toilet? The idea of scrubbing their hands with soap simply wasn't part of everyday hygiene. Fresh water was mainly used for bathing, fountains, drinking supplies, and flushing waste away. A civilization could move water across vast stretches of land and still overlook the two hands right in front of them. Human beings can be strangely good at solving enormous problems while missing very small ones. And Rome was far from the only example. Across the Atlantic, the Aztecs were known for habits of cleanliness that surprised the Spanish when they arrived. Many Aztecs bathed frequently, sometimes twice a day, kept their streets remarkably clean, and even used natural substances to control body odor. But wait, that cleanliness was mostly tied to appearance, social customs, and religion. They weren't washing their hands because they believed microscopic pathogens were sitting on the skin, ready to move from one person to another. So here's the real question. How could civilizations intelligent enough to build cities, develop medicine, and study the sky fail to realize that washing their hands could prevent disease? The answer wasn't laziness. It was the scientific limits of the world they lived in. To understand their behavior, we have to step into a time when people explained sickness using an entirely different set of rules. The invisible enemy. The biggest reason was incredibly simple. They couldn't see bacteria. Microscopes didn't exist, which meant the entire microbial world was completely invisible. A hand that looked perfectly clean could still be covered with countless microscopic organisms, but to someone living at the time, there was no obvious evidence that any of them were there. Think about that for a second. It's almost impossible to defend yourself against an enemy when you don't even know the enemy exists. So their definition of clean hands was based almost entirely on what the senses could detect. If your hands were covered in mud, food, blood, grease, or something sticky, you might rinse or wipe them off. But if they looked clean and didn't smell unpleasant, the problem seemed solved. Those same hands could then touch food or an open wound without raising much concern. From their point of view, that made perfect sense. The problem is that bacteria don't care whether your hands look clean. Now imagine traveling back to the ancient world and telling a warrior that millions of invisible creatures were crawling across his hands. There's a good chance he would stare at you as if you had just invented some bizarre fantasy. Ancient people were often more prepared to believe that illness came from divine punishment, curses, or supernatural forces than from organisms too small to see multiplying inside the body. That sounds strange to us now. But without a microscope, germs would have sounded almost as unbelievable as invisible monsters. Here's the surprising part. A few people came remarkably close to the truth. Around 30 BC, the Roman scholar Marcus Varro wrote about extremely tiny creatures that could float through the air, enter the body through the mouth and nose, and cause disease. It was an astonishing idea for its time. But there was one huge problem. He couldn't show these creatures to anyone. There was no microscope and no experiment powerful enough to prove they existed. So the idea remained little more than speculation and was largely forgotten for roughly the next 1,900 years. And when people couldn't blame bacteria, they had to find another explanation. so they built entire systems of medicine around other possible causes. Illness might be blamed on angry gods, evil spirits, curses, or frightening forces in nature. That led to treatments involving prayer, offerings, rituals, and attempts to drive supernatural forces from the body. To us, those explanations can sound completely foreign. But in a world where no one could see microbes, they were among the few ways people had to explain how someone who seemed perfectly healthy yesterday could suddenly become dangerously sick today. Then came one of the most powerful medical explanations of the ancient world, the Greek theory of the four humors. For thousands of years, physicians believed that health depended on maintaining the right balance between four fluids inside the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you developed a fever, stomach pain, or sudden weakness, they weren't looking for something that had entered your body from the outside. They assumed one of those internal fluids had fallen out of balance. And once disease was understood as a problem happening inside the patient, whether the doctor had washed his hands barely seemed relevant. Here's where things get even stranger. If illness was caused by having too much of one humor, then the obvious solution was to remove some of it. That meant bloodletting, purging, and other aggressive treatments designed to restore the body's supposed balance. Within that system of medicine, washing your hands before treating a wound or performing surgery offered no obvious benefit. The problem, they believed, was in the patient's blood and bodily fluids, not on the physician's fingers. Fear of bad air. But the theory of humors was only part of the story. Ancient and later physicians also feared another invisible enemy: miasma, or bad air. When disease seemed to appear around swamps, rotting animal remains, sewage, or places filled with terrible smells, people noticed the pattern. So they reached what seemed like a reasonable conclusion. The foul air itself must be causing illness. Even the word malaria comes from an old Italian expression meaning bad air. They had noticed a real connection between filthy environments and disease. They had simply blamed the wrong thing. So if you lived in a world shaped by the miasma theory, protecting yourself from illness might mean closing your windows at night, avoiding fog, or burning fragrant herbs to purify the air. People feared that poisonous particles drifting through the atmosphere could enter the body with every breath. And from their perspective, that made sense. The real danger might have been contaminated water or dirty hands spreading infection right in front of them, but those threats were invisible and often odorless. There was nothing obvious to warn them, and this is where the logic became almost completely reversed. During certain periods in Europe, physicians even warned that bathing in warm water could be dangerous. They believed heat caused the pores of the skin to open like tiny doors. Once those doors were open, harmful air could supposedly slip inside the body and damage the organs. Think about that for a second. Something we now associate with cleanliness and comfort could once be viewed almost as an invitation for disease to enter. So what was the solution? Leave the body's natural oils alone, and maybe even keep a little dirt on the skin. Some people believed that this layer could seal the pores and act as a barrier against dangerous air. Under that logic, scrubbing the body too thoroughly with harsh cleansers didn't make you safer. It might actually strip away your protection. With modern medical knowledge, that sounds like a terrible strategy. But inside the world of miasma theory, it had its own strange kind of logic. As a result, the idea of being clean gradually shifted towards something much easier to see: clothing, especially white linen. People believed linen could absorb sweat and impurities from the body, so changing into fresh garments was seen as a way to become clean without bathing frequently. A bright white collar also became a visible sign of status, refinement, and personal order. Someone's skin might not have touched water in quite some time, but if the linen was fresh, white, and pleasant smelling, that person could still be considered perfectly clean. But wait, didn't soap already exist by then? It did, and that brings us to another strange part of the story. Ancient people had known how to make soap-like cleaning substances for thousands of years, but they were not originally designed for washing hands. Soap was largely treated as a practical cleaning agent for textiles, wool, grease, and other stubborn materials. It was closer to an industrial cleaner than the gentle bar sitting beside a modern sink. Some of the earliest known soap-like recipes appear on Babylonian clay tablets dating back to around 2800 BC. The Babylonians mixed plant ashes, including ashes from agricultural materials, with oils to create substances capable of removing grease. Some ancient recipes were even connected to specific rituals or times. But despite having this technology surprisingly early, they mainly used these mixtures for cleaning textiles, fabrics, and other materials. They did not turn soap into the everyday hand-washing habit we would recognize today. And there was a very understandable reason for that. Ancient soap was not exactly gentle. It was often made by combining animal fats with strongly alkaline wood ash. The result could smell unpleasant, feel harsh, and leave the skin dry, irritated, or damaged with repeated use. Imagine being told to scrub your hands every day with something that smelled like cooked fat and could sting your skin. Suddenly, it becomes easier to understand why people weren't eager to make it part of their daily routine. But if soap wasn't the answer, how did Greeks and Romans actually clean themselves? That's where the story gets even more interesting. Cleaning without soap. Instead of soap, the ancient Greeks and Romans had a very different way of cleaning the body: olive oil. After exercise or before bathing, they would rub oil over their skin. That sounds almost backward to us, since we usually use soap to remove oil. But for them, the oil helped loosen sweat, dust, and grime stuck to the body. Their skin would end up coated in a shiny layer of olive oil. And then came the interesting part: they weren't planning to simply rinse it all away with water. Instead, they used a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape the dirty oil from the skin. Picture an athlete finishing a workout, his body slick with olive oil, then dragging this curved tool across his arms, shoulders, and back. Sweat, dust, dead skin, and grime came away with the oil. Visually, it worked pretty well. The skin looked cleaner, smoother, and even smelled better. But here was the problem. The method mainly removed what people could see and feel. Microscopic organisms could still remain on the skin and, more importantly, on the hands. And if olive oil still sounds fairly reasonable, the Romans also used something that would make most people today wrinkle their noses: urine. Collection jars were placed along some streets, and the urine was later taken to laundries. This wasn't simply because the Romans enjoyed doing strange things. As urine sits, it produces ammonia, which is surprisingly effective at breaking down grease. Laundry workers could use it to clean cloth and clothing. It sounds like the setup to a joke. It wasn't. And the story gets stranger. Some Romans even used urine in dental cleaning because they believed its cleansing properties could help make teeth look whiter. Think about that for a second. Someone could handle a substance being used as a cleaner, then sit down at a meal and use those same hands to pick up food. As far as they were concerned, if the hands no longer looked dirty, there was no obvious problem. The bacteria, of course, remained completely invisible. But public toilets reveal the real contradiction between Roman engineering and Roman hygiene. Their latrines could be impressively sophisticated, with running water beneath long rows of seats. Yet instead of toilet paper, Romans may have used a sponge attached to the end of a stick, commonly known as a tersorium. After use, the sponge could be rinsed or dipped into a liquid such as salt water or vinegar. Some interpretations suggest that these tools may have been shared. So you had an advanced sewage system paired with a hygiene practice that, by modern standards, sounds deeply unsettling. That meant public latrines could also become places where parasites and disease-causing organisms spread easily. Eggs from intestinal worms and pathogens linked to diarrhea could survive in shared sanitation environments. Roman drainage systems were excellent at carrying waste away, but they could not solve a problem no one understood: contamination on hands, surfaces, and shared objects. And that's worth thinking about. You can build incredibly advanced technology, but if you misunderstand how disease spreads, even great engineering has serious limits. The luxurious public baths weren't completely safe either. Romans loved soaking in warm communal pools, and physicians sometimes even recommended bathing to people who were sick, injured, or recovering. But large numbers of people were sharing the same bathing spaces, bringing sweat, skin oils, dirt, and other contaminants into the water. The pools were not necessarily refreshed and disinfected the way a modern swimming pool would be. So a place designed to make people feel cleaner could also, unintentionally, give disease another opportunity to move from one person to another. But wait, Haven't religions been telling people to wash their hands for thousands of years? Yes, religious traditions such as Judaism and later Islam developed specific rules involving washing the hands, the body, or performing purification before certain activities. In Judaism, for example, the practice known as netilat yadayim involves pouring water over the hands, including before eating bread. From a modern perspective, that can look remarkably close to the idea of hand hygiene. But there is an important difference. These practices were not based on germ theory. Their purpose was connected to ritual, religious, or spiritual purity, not the removal of microorganisms from the skin. People performing them were not imagining millions of bacteria being washed away. So water considered appropriate for a ritual was not necessarily being judged by modern microbiological standards. Someone could perform the ceremony perfectly and believe their hands were purified even if invisible pathogens were still present in the water. And then history produced another strange irony. As Greek medicine increasingly tried to explain disease through natural causes, rather than relying only on gods and supernatural forces, physicians gradually separated medicine from many religious rituals. In one sense, this was a major step toward rational scientific thinking. But because they still had no idea germs existed, ritual hand washing was not replaced by a strong medical reason to wash the hands. In many situations, hand washing remained mostly social, ceremonial, or symbolic. And that may be the most surprising part. Sometimes humans can abandon the wrong explanation before they have enough knowledge to realize that one piece of the old behavior was accidentally useful. By the Middle Ages, hand washing was still around, but it often functioned more as a social ritual than a way to protect anyone from disease. At an aristocratic feast, servants might carry silver bowls filled with scented water infused with rose petals or herbs. Guests would dip their fingers, wipe their hands, and begin eating. It looked elegant and refined. But the main goal was to make the hands smell pleasant, remove visible grease, and display good manners and social status. No one was thinking, I just reduced my chances of spreading an infection. In their world, germs still weren't part of the story. If a guest's hands looked clean, no mud, no obvious grease, that was usually good enough. People could reach into shared dishes with their fingers, take food from large platters in the center of the table, and eat alongside everyone else without sensing any danger. And this is one of the hardest things to imagine from a modern perspective. A hand can look perfectly clean while still carrying disease. But if you have no way to see that danger, you have very little reason to fear it. And the problem didn't stop at the dinner table. It followed people into the one place we would expect to be the cleanest of all: the hospital. Even surgeons once had a completely different attitude toward cleanliness. Well into the 19th century, a surgical coat covered in old, dried blood could actually be seen as a sign of experience. It suggested that the doctor had performed many operations. In other words, something that would make a modern surgeon change clothes immediately could once function almost like a badge of professional honor. History has a habit of doing this. Things that once symbolized expertise can later become evidence of just how badly we misunderstood the problem. The consequences were especially devastating in maternity hospitals. A doctor might take part in an autopsy and then walk directly into a delivery room without washing his hands or changing his clothes. From his point of view, there was no accepted theory saying that something dangerous could be carried from a dead body to a living patient. But then women who had just given birth began developing severe fevers and dying from what became known as puerperal or childbed fever. Doctors watched this happen again and again. What they didn't realize was that their own hands could be helping cause it. The doctor who changed everything. Then, in the 1840s, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed something deeply troubling at Vienna General Hospital. There were two maternity clinics. One was staffed by doctors and medical students, while the other was largely run by midwives. Yet mothers were dying at a much higher rate in the doctor's clinic. Semmelweis began asking the obvious question: what was different between the two? Eventually, one detail stood out. The doctors and students regularly worked with cadavers. The midwives did not. In 1847, Semmelweis introduced a rule that sounds almost laughably simple today, but was revolutionary at the time. Doctors had to wash their hands in a chlorine-based solution before touching women in labor. He chose the solution largely because it removed the foul odor that remained on their hands after autopsies. Then something remarkable happened. Death rates in the maternity ward dropped dramatically from levels that sometimes approached 18% to below 2%. No miracle drug, no revolutionary machine, just cleaner hands. Think about that for a second. But this is where the story becomes frustrating. Instead of being immediately celebrated, Semmelweis faced fierce resistance. Many doctors hated the suggestion that their own hands might be carrying something deadly from corpses to patients. It challenged their pride, their professional identity, and the medical theories they had been taught to trust. Worse, Semmelweis could show that hand washing worked, but he still couldn't fully explain why. He couldn't see bacteria. He didn't yet have germ theory to support him. His career eventually collapsed, and the final years of his life were tragic. It took years before the missing pieces finally began falling into place. Louis Pasteur produced powerful evidence that microscopic organisms were involved in processes like decay and disease. Robert Koch developed methods that helped connect specific microorganisms with specific illnesses. Then Joseph Lister carried these ideas into surgery, using antiseptic techniques to reduce infection. Suddenly, hand washing was no longer just a vague habit or ritual. There was finally a clear enemy behind it: germs. Around the same era, during the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale pushed for major improvements in sanitation inside military hospitals. She promoted cleaner wards, better care of patients, and greater attention to personal and environmental hygiene. Interestingly, Nightingale was still influenced by miasma theory. She didn't yet have the complete scientific explanation, but many of the sanitation measures she promoted still improved hospital conditions and reduced opportunities for disease to spread. Sometimes people discover the right action before they fully understand why it works. And now come back to something so ordinary that most of us barely notice it. You turn on a faucet, use a little soap, scrub your hands for about 20 seconds, and rinse them clean. The entire process takes less than a minute. But behind that tiny routine are thousands of years of misunderstanding disease. Ancient cities, Roman bathhouses, unwashed doctors, bitter scientific arguments, and finally the rise of germ theory. The clean hands we take for granted today are more than a hygiene habit. They are the result of a revolution in the way humans learn to understand an invisible world. And maybe that is the most remarkable part of the story. Sometimes one of civilization's greatest advances isn't a gigantic machine or a towering monument. Sometimes it is simply understanding why we should wash our hands.